Kia ora and welcome to another 1 of 200 and anti-war Aotearoa expert panel to discuss some of the issues, media, politics around the illegal US and Israel war on Iran. I'm joined again by some familiar faces and one new face. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the myths that are being used to justify this ongoing illegal war, justify the atrocities that are taking place across West Asia, but particularly we're going to be focusing on Iran again this evening. And yeah, trying to unpack a couple of those, because even as we are seeing them kind of pulled apart by analysts and by critique, our leaders are still using them quite regularly in the way that they speak about the war and to try and justify the actions they're taking and the support that they're giving to the United States and Israel as they undertake these war crimes. I'm joined by three panelists. Two from last fortnight, you'll remember, Gabriella and Mahdis. We've also got Eugene Doyle this evening as well. We're just going to quickly intro everyone. I'm Kyle. I'm from 1 of 200. I'm the co-founder and one of the co-hosts for that left-wing media organization. Eugene, do you want to quickly intro who you are?
Yeah, kia ora koutou, ko Eugene Doyle ahau. So I'm from Te Whanganui Aotearoa, O'Whero Bay in Wellington, and I host solidarity.co.nz. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Mahdis.
Kia ora, I'm Mahdis. I'm a peace and conflict studies scholar, I guess by profession, and Iranian German activist in some way, but also an academic by profession.
Kia ora. And Gabriella.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, ko Gabriella Brayne, tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Maniapoto, me Hamoa. I'm a lawyer by trade, but I'm here today actually more in a co-facilitational role, opposed to answering and providing expertise, where I obviously defer to the two incredible panelists that are present today. But I'm also here on behalf of AWA, or Anti-War Aotearoa, which is an organisation, for those who weren't part of the last conversation, that was launched in March 2026. So in response to the illegal war on Iran. And as a whole, AWA is committed to ending New Zealand's complicity in wars of aggression, period.
Kia ora. And welcome to our audience. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been involved in helping to set this up, the other folks over at Anti-War Aotearoa, and to Dylan, our producer, lurking in the background and making sure the video and audio goes well. As the same as last panel, we've got comments turned off, but you can reach out to us on Instagram or on Blue Sky or wherever else you find us to ask any questions or to seek further clarification as needed. But we just want to keep the conversation focused and clean for the evening. So recent polling has just been done here in Aotearoa, and that shows that 87% of Kiwis either strongly or somewhat agreed that New Zealand should avoid direct military involvement, while 83% held the view that military action would only trigger further attacks on other countries. This is probably one of the stronger polls that I've seen around these sorts of issues in my political lifetime. But despite this, our politicians in New Zealand, but also across the West, even as the polling kind of turns this way in all these other countries, they continue to justify the support of the illegal US-Israel war in Iran in a variety of ways. We're going to try and tackle some of those today. These will be familiar to you. You will have seen these consistently run out by politicians when they're trying to say why they're giving verbal support to the US, why they're perhaps thinking of giving physical military support. And you would have seen them in the media, as those are often reported without much critique, even in cases where the truthfulness of those is pretty clear, or otherwise. So I wanted to kick off with one of the more consistent justifications which has been given. And maybe you can help us with this one, Eugene. This is one that's been repeated by New Zealand's Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, which is that bombing Iran has been necessary to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And I think there's a pretty infamous clip from a few weeks back where he was asked, what actions would you take to stop this? And he said, any actions. Now, this, of course, completely contradicts US assessments and international nuclear agency assessments of what Iran is actually doing with its nuclear materials. So what should we make of this? What should we make of why this is being run out as a justification and the truthfulness of it?
Great. Well, I think cutting straight to the chase, if Iran had wanted nuclear weapons, and you remember for the past 30 years, people like Netanyahu have been showing little bomb diagrams and saying Iran's only 2 weeks or a month away from nuclear weapons. And they've been doing that for decades now. And the simple reality is if Iran had wanted nuclear weapons, they would have had them a very long time ago, because they have the science base, the technology, the material to create nuclear weapons, but they were stopped. And I think everyone should really be aware that one person in particular stopped Iran's nuclear program, or their nuclear ambitions, their ambitions rather. And that was, in fact, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So that's the leader who was killed on the very first day of the US-Israeli war of aggression. So they actually killed the guy who had successfully put a fatwa, a religious decree, banning any development of nuclear weapons. So, completely incoherent from the Western point of view. Now, I think another really important thing to say is non-proliferation. That means, like in 1970, there was the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that basically tried to encourage the nations of the world to sign up to say we won't go nuclear, so we won't expand the number of nuclear powers. And in principle, that's a terrifically good idea, but it puts an awesome responsibility on the nuclear powers that they must not attack the non-nuclear powers. They have to respect the sovereign territory of the non-nuclear powers. And unfortunately, we don't live in such a world. And we have two nuclear powers, Israel and the United States, attacking a non-nuclear power. And I would just say, I cannot think of a more compelling reason for a country to acquire nuclear weapons than what the Americans and the Israelis have just done.
Just on that, Eugene, why do you think there is such an intense focus on whether Iran has nuclear capabilities, while other states are under no such scrutiny?
Sure, I think the most important aspect of all of this, from what I can understand, is that the real game here is to drive Iran into a weakened state. So for the Israelis and the Americans to do to a major power like Iran, a significant player, they want to do to Iran what has been done to Libya, to Iraq, to Syria, to Lebanon. And we should always remember this. This is just the latest chapter in an ongoing project to completely, and of course, Iran was always the big cherry in the region because it is big, it is powerful, it is a significant economy, but this is part of a long-running strategy. So I think in some ways the nuclear issue is a red herring, because I don't think. And you just have to look at the assessments by the NSA and others in the United States. They did not perceive an imminent threat of nuclear weapons. And also the other thing, just one other thing I'd say is, why would a power like Iran seek nuclear weapons? And despite the nonsense coming out of Washington about, they want to acquire weapons to bomb Europe or to attack America, I think this is complete hogwash. The whole idea of a power like Iran possibly thinking about nuclear weapons is actually as a deterrence. They want to get these monsters off their backs, and that's so if you want to have a non-proliferation, then respect the territorial integrity of the sovereign state of Iran.
Kia ora, Eugene. Mahdis, I think in the same press conference, Luxon also noted that, and this is, again, a lot of this just sounds ludicrous to me at this point, but he said, the violence overseen by the Iranian regime has extended beyond its borders. It is responsible for much of the instability and terror experienced throughout the Middle East over the decades. And Luxon then went on to use that as well as justification for why this illegal war had to be started by the US against Iran. What do you make of that sort of justification?
I think it's quite rich to use the question of peace as a deciding factor. So if we were to look really closely, the country that causes most instability immediately in West Asia is Israel, because it is the state that has waged war on every single neighbor it has, and the neighbors' neighbors as well. So that is number one. The second one would be, in the last 20 years alone, the US has waged wars in all of Iran's neighboring countries. So some of them Eugene just mentioned. So to then turn around and say Iran is the biggest source of instability in West Asia is a blatant lie. So from just, I guess, within our lifetime or my lifetime alone, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we have the destabilization and the overthrow of the Syrian government, and now, Syria is definitely not a stable democratic country, as the West likes to promise nations and their people, to say, if you support us and you overthrow a regime, things will be better for you. So we see this destabilization happening around Iran. We see Israel occupying not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, having expansionist interests in Lebanon. It's now occupying Lebanon, or it already occupied Lebanon in the 1980s. So there are these countries that very openly and explicitly engage in forms of warfare and aggression, yet Iran is described as the source of instability. So I think there are two problems there. One is, how is peace defined when it comes to the West, right? We engage in warfare, but somehow get to call ourselves peaceful. So Israel can engage in occupation, in genocide, and still claim to be a peaceful democratic country. And Iran can not engage in warfare and not invade other countries and be described as a non-peaceful country. So I think we need to be very careful how words are being used and just look at the facts on the ground. The other way in which peace is mobilized is through the discourse of democracy. So peace is always already attached to democracy, so that democratic countries by default become peaceful even when they are engaging in warfare. And that has a much, much longer history of how that has been constructed, this idea of where peaceful countries sit and where countries that are barbaric and violent sit. That has very much a geographical mapping of north and south. Within Europe, I think there is a divide between the west and the eastern parts of Europe. So those are discourses that have circulated for a long time. So I think with Iran, we're just refreshing those. And identifying Iran as a source of instability or as an enemy basically goes back to the time of the revolution. And we see that not only play out in the political discourse, but also in popular culture. So how Iran has been depicted in popular culture as this backward, barbaric, violent place. So I think Hollywood movies of the 1980s are a really good place to look for the depiction of Arabs and Iranians and the quote unquote Middle East, right? So that has kind of been circulating as well. So I think we see that playing out with Afghanistan in the early 2000s, with Iraq, with Libya. So I think these are things that are not necessarily exceptional to Iran, but Iran, of course, has withstood some of that. So since 1979, it has been this country that has been able to resist U.S. kind of imperial power in one way or another.
I think that covers it. Awesome. My question was more so, focusing on, well, from an anti-imperialist point of view, what are the sources of instability? But I think you've already mapped that so clearly, as well as the West's investment in that instability within the region, despite trying to sort of claim the moral high ground here and have this sort of like paternalistic view, which is really just a justification for intervention, which we know is such a destabilizing, destructive project.
Well, I think what we've seen, what maybe makes sense to mention is the expansion of U.S. military presence in the region across a number of countries, particularly surrounding Iran. I know there's these memes that circulate about, Iran is such a threat. Look how closely, like the U.S. military bases are to it. And I think humor is sometimes helpful in exaggerating really some of these lies and saying, wow, it becomes really absurd not to see it for what it is. So the expansion of military bases across West Asia is one. The destabilization of other countries, and with a destabilization, of course, you can't, like, that also has a ripple effect on other countries. The deliberate interference and trying to halt separate development or sovereign development in the region, which then impacts the economic possibilities that countries have, and of course that impacts the populations within those countries and how those populations then perceive the states that they live in. So I think there's multiple layers of instability that are being created through broader speaking, like imperialism, but also through the expansion of militarism in the region. And it has basically created out of West Asia a laboratory for warfare. So we talk about the Middle East in the European imagination as a place that somehow is always at war, without ever asking ourselves, who are these wars instigated by? And also, no, this region has not been at war for 500 years. But there are particular kind of wars for particular kinds of interest. So it's just fleshing that out again and go back to the facts, because I think the facts do speak for themselves.
Coming off the back of that, I do want to kind of tackle this question of the support for proxy terrorist groups, which we've heard from the US spokespeople as well, but has also been parroted here in New Zealand. Quickly, just before you answer that, though, can you just tilt your camera back slightly, Mahdis, just because it's currently topping off the top of your head.
Oh, there we go.
Fantastic. So, yeah, you've got these groups that are being called like proxies of Iran, who are there and being blamed for causing this instability, often with reference to how they interact with Israel. How should we think of those instead? And how useful of a justification is that for US war making?
So I think I'll try to tackle that question on two levels. So one is on the linguistic level and what the language does around proxy and around terrorism. And that the label of terrorism in particular is not an innocent label that does not get applied evenly. Now, when I say this, I don't mean to suddenly use that label for everything and everyone, and that creates the equality. What I'm trying to say is that it's a particular history, it has a particular history, it's used in certain ways, and we should really be careful to not reproduce it without questioning it and its problematic nature. So who gets defined as a terrorist in the international world system? There's a clear tendency that those are often groups that are not official state groups and aligned with Islam. There's some exceptions to that terrorism label, but it's often, certain groups, and religion plays a big factor, and it's not applied equally, right? So it's not even applied to the people that we might think fit the label, but might be closer to US political interest. So I think that is one that is important for us to consider, and is also important to us to consider when people willy-nilly try to get everything that they don't like prescribed as terrorism. The other one, of course, is a proxy. So we don't necessarily talk about Israel as a US proxy. I know some people might, and some people might refer to Israel as a US military base in the Middle East. But overall, in the political system, we don't describe the allies of the US as proxies of the US. So it has a very specific purpose that it tries to mobilize in the imagination of people, of Iran as this powerful country puppeteering these terrorist groups to act in its interest. Now, what that leaves out is that these groups have their own histories of antagonism with Israel and the United States, and with US militarism more generally. And they're not connected by being told by Iran what to do, but they're connected in the shared struggles, right? So that's, I think, really important. And to paint these groups as proxies, I think, is also to take away from some of the legitimate grievances that these groups have with Israel in particular. I'm thinking about Hezbollah. So to consider Hezbollah as just a simple outpost of Iran inside Lebanon, I think would completely disregard the history of Israeli violence on Lebanon and its present violence, and what I would say is probably an extension of genocidal violence from Gaza to parts of Lebanon, where Israel is basically obliterating entire villages, right? So I think that's number one. The other one is to say, how come these groups are in relationship with each other instead of being proxy? So I think instead of taking away the agency of these groups, is to say, well, what kinds of relationships are they engaging in? And can we really trace that Iran is the big puppeteer who tells them what to do? And we actually can't. Right, so we can see there are moments in which Iran currently now is trying to include a ceasefire in Lebanon within its own ceasefire, but it hasn't done so by engaging directly in the war between the resistance and Israel inside Lebanon. It does not tell Ansar Allah what to do and when to act, but I think these relationships exist because of a shared experience, for sure. They might exist because of a shared ideological approach to the question of empire in the US in particular. But I think that the idea of the proxy really feeds into this narrative of the big, evil, dangerous country that is just sitting and waiting and plotting against the world, really, is how it's framed, right? Because they are describing Iran as not only the biggest threat to stability in the Middle East, in some places Iran is described as the biggest threat to world peace. Okay? I mean, we need to let that sink in. It's described as the biggest threat to world peace, the country that in the last, 40 years before the war, the 12-day war, and the most recent illegal war of aggression on Iran, so did not initiate neither of those wars, is described as the biggest threat to world peace. Now, you don't have to like Iran to say that that is inaccurate.
Eugene, I might just bring you in here as well, because you've done a lot of, I guess, coverage and critique of the way that some of the things that Mahdis has just talked about has been approached in Western media. Do you have anything extra to add just around the way that that word proxies, or this idea of Iran as the big evil in the world has been used in media and in politics to try and justify what's happening there?
I guess I'd use one word. Oh, I agree with everything Mahdis said. And I just use one word, a Jewish word, chutzpah. It's an enormous chutzpah. It's just such a cheek to suggest that countries cannot have allies that they share interests and struggles with, and that countries do not have the right to self-defense. So, you take just one of them, Yemen, Ansar Allah, the Houthis. Well, good Lord, most of the world is completely unaware of the fact that the Saudi blockade of Yemen, which was supported with enormous armaments from the United States of America and all sorts of surveillance apparatus and all of that, and munitions from the United Kingdom, and to our shame, the participation of a small New Zealand force in Operation Prosperity Guardian. We've been part of a process that has seen the destruction of 400,000 human beings in Yemen, an absolute disgrace that New Zealand should have had no part of. But we sort of parade around presenting ourselves as these noble, civilized people, and it's quite despicable what our team has been up to. So I think it's very appropriate that these countries who are standing against this terrible genocidal ambition of this joint venture between the United States of America and Israel, and that's in Gaza, that's in the West Bank, that's in Lebanon, and also you bring in players like the United Arab Emirates, who get a very light pass, and yet they've been deeply involved in all of these criminalities in Yemen. In Sudan, they have a leading role in the horrors going on in Sudan at the moment, and in Libya, sporting that terrible civil war that's been going on for 15 years now. So yeah, I just think the appropriate word there for the West preaching from high pulpits is chutzpah.
Yeah, kia ora to that. Also just reminds me as well of the framing of regimes versus governments in terms of who's privileged, to have that label applied to them, within the kind of geopolitical order, and just how absolutely ridiculous it is, and it makes me want to use the word proxy a lot more in describing New Zealand's own relationships to the US imperialism and our complicity in the horrific genocidal crimes of Israel.
I think language is really important. I think language is how these ideas become operationalized and normalized and then get acted on. And I think sometimes we as individuals aren't necessarily aware of how our language might contribute to that. And because we might think of something as a regime, because it might fit the labeling and the description of a regime, we don't necessarily think of its uneven application, and that we're contributing to normalization of certain countries having their sovereignty, made conditional, or just kind of making them illegitimate with our language already. And yes, I think that's really important. And I'm definitely a person who used to use the word Iranian regime quite a lot, and had to do a real unlearning of doing that. And I didn't think that calling the US regime was the answer. I didn't know if that was doing the evening out in the same way as just respectfully referring to everything as a government, and then focusing on the nuances and the actual political practices within those nations. Because I know some people say, you know, like the US regime, the Epstein regime, which I personally don't think is doing the job. So governments, it is.
I went on the same journey, I must admit. And I think the appropriate way, the way to resolve this very easily is just at the United Nations, when they call a country to the podium, they don't say, and now the speaker from the regime of Britain, you know, it's always the government, you know, and that's the correct language for the United Nations. And I think it's the one we should all just adopt. Yeah.
Moving on to kind of an issue which has been a little bit more absurd in the way it's been framed up, because it just feels so much more brute forced as a way to support the ongoing war, but particularly to draw in other Western allies to support this war of aggression. And that's this idea that the US needs to open the Strait of Hormuz back up. You know, the New Zealand government, not the New Zealand regime, has also indicated its willingness to support stabilization efforts there. Not quite sold on sending a force there just yet, but like it's not off the table for them. We know that the Strait was open up until this illegal war was launched. Eugene, what is happening there, and how is this narrative operating to try and build further support for the illegal war?
Sure. Well, I think, I mean, we're just so used to amnesia, you know, like history started on October 7th, as we know it did not, in respect to the Palestinian struggle. And then you have our leaders, you know, Luxon and co, all of them banging on about the freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, international rules-based orders and all of this, and the illegality of what Iran is doing. And it's as if they had just woken up from a sleep and hadn't realized that there'd been a war, that the United States of America and Israel launched a war of aggression on the sovereign state of Iran. They killed leaders. They've done hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage, and they've killed thousands of people, including 168 children at Manab on the first day of the war. So just terrible war crimes, you know, just appalling. Now, anybody who followed the Iranian positions over the last couple of years, and obviously the Americans counted in that number, knew what the Iranians were going to do. They made it very clear. If we are attacked, we will take control of the Hormuz Strait, and we will escalate horizontally. We'll attack your co-belligerents, your partners in the Gulf states as well as Israel. And that's exactly what the Iranians have done. And in respect to this business of the controlling the Strait of Hormuz, I'm actually of the view that it's a brilliant maneuver and should be a long-term solution, because what the Iranians are proposing is nothing terribly outrageous. They're going to impose transit charges on shipping that goes through the strait, you know, as has been done in many places at many times over many centuries. And what they seem to be charging is about 1%. So you know, these very large carriers, you know, take about $200 million worth of oil. They're clipping the ticket as they pass through the strait. They take 2 million apparently, you know, which is I would have thought a terribly elegant and terribly reasonable solution to this issue. You know, if you asked any of our political leaders, particularly Luxon and Peters, how on earth do you propose for Iran to receive reparations for the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage done to their infrastructure and the grievous assault on their sovereignty, the killing of thousands of their citizens, including not just at Manab, but hundreds of children. And I would have thought actually giving Iran the opportunity to rebuild as it must do via transit fees, because the Israelis and Americans certainly aren't going to pay reparations, is a very elegant solution.
Just taking things further in terms of the implications here, how do you think the events that we're seeing unfold, how could they radically reshape the global economic order? You know, thinking about the US petrodollar and
yeah. Well, we live in interesting times, and I think, none of us knows for sure what's going to happen. None of us, but we're certainly aware that the Iranian government has tabled a letter with the United Nations calling for reparations against the Gulf states. They've got a law before the parliament that formalizes their control of Hormuz Strait. They've talked about payment in Chinese yuan. So this business of actually de-dollarization and breaking up the petrodollar, it's a very real event. And you have scholars like Professor Bob Pape from the University of Chicago, who says if Iran succeeds in staving off this brutal imperialist assault, Iran will emerge from this as a fourth world power, as a fourth superpower, most certainly the weakest of the four, but nonetheless it has the possibility of actually becoming a more substantial power. The Americans and the Israelis, their project is to break it up, to destroy it as a power. But one can only hope, or I certainly hope, that Iran as a sovereign state, as a multi-century project for a sovereign state, will survive and thrive, that its people will thrive, and that Iran will be a valuable contributor to the emergence of what some call a multipolar world order, a successor to the unipolar moment we lived through for most of our lives. And I certainly welcome that. I think that's not something to be feared, but to be welcomed.
Kia ora.
If I may add to that something real quick, and it's to look at the facts that what Iran has been able to make possible by withstanding the assaults by US and Israel, two of the most powerful militaries in the globe, right? So it has managed to survive, it has managed to respond, it has not crumbled as anticipated. It has really shown the weakness of empire, and I think it's made possible to imagine an end to US imperial power. I think that's really, really important. That's one. And the other one is it's exposed to a lot of people the fragility of the capitalist system that we take so for granted. So again, I think people are often hung up on what Iran means to them or the value judgment they have to put on Iran as a country. And they don't want to consider some of these facts that are happening in real life. And that is this is going to be, I mean, it's already the end of the petrodollar because people have got, ships have been allowed through the strait trading in yuan. That's huge. That is, I think, a really huge step, and it's showing us what a world might look like that is not dominated by one power. And also to remind people who are now responding, not because they care about the lost lives and not because they care about live stream genocide, but because it hits them in their pockets. They are also realizing that this system is not, we can't maintain it. And if we can't maintain it, than our regular people in countries that have nothing to do with what their government decides, which is many people. And we can see that in the polls that Kai was mentioning at the very beginning. They're opting out of this because they're suddenly very personally impacted by these things that may have seemed far away, which really aren't far away, but at least could have been invisible to them. So I think it's really important that we talk about how this has exposed capitalism and the violence of capitalism, and how much capitalism needs warfare to be upheld, right? So I think all of these cracks, no matter what happens, have made this exposure possible, and we need to be willing to look at it and not so caught up in our own, in the decisions of how we look at the world. And I think some people are just holding on to their glasses, to their lenses that they see the world with, and they're just like, don't take them off. And I just think, take them off. I mean, you can put them back on afterwards, but have a look at what's happening, and take it at its face value, and then go back to your glasses if you so wish.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful framing of the wider economic implications here. Again, because, you know, a lot of the focus has been on the fuel crisis and, you know, the ways in which our government is you know, horrendously fumbling that, you know, and the material repercussions. But I think it's also important to kind of have this wider scope of hope when it comes to, you know, the shattering of capitalism, the fall of Western imperialism, and the kind of hope that lies in a multipolar reality moving forward. And, you know, hopefully that is what emerges from all of this chaos.
I'd chip
yep.
I'd chip in one little thing there. I thought that was great. That word hope, you know, I think we should have reason for a bit of hope at the moment, because you know, the dominant narrative, and as Gramsci and people talked about a very long time ago, the dominant ideas in society are those of the ruling class. So we're well represented by our mainstream media. And what's really wonderful, and the polling Kyle mentioned right at the beginning about New Zealanders just aren't buying it. They're not buying it, and neither are the Americans, neither are the European populations. They do not buy their narrative. And I think this breakdown of narrative control is a wonderful opportunity for us to really encourage New Zealanders to say, America is not our friend. And, for example, China's not our enemy. And it's an opportunity to say we should move away from these alliances with the United States and being part of these eternal wars of aggression and forever wars and all of that. So I just say that's a moment of hope.
Kia ora. I think similarly to the what do you call it, double meanings around opening up the strait. You've also had these justifications around responding to Iran's retaliatory attacks or their aggression on their neighbors. Eugene, how do we unpack that? How do we consider the way in which every time Iran responds, whether it's closing the strait or whether it's hitting some of the US bases in nearby neighboring countries to respond against this war of aggression, that gets flipped against them by Western politicians and by Western media outlets into yet another reason to continue the war of aggression against Iran?
Yeah, interesting. Well, look, I think the Code of Hammurabi was written in Babylonia, you know, sort of Iraq, about, I'm not sure when it was about 3,500 years ago. And they had a phrase that pops up in the Bible, actually. It's called an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And I think that's the sort of law of retribution that the Iranians are trying to apply. They don't want to apply it, but they're saying, if you hit us, we will hit you back. and they're trying to school the West that you cannot attack Iran without consequences, and the West seems to be learning this lesson very slowly. So, I'll give you one example. Like I was probably the only writer in New Zealand who mentioned Ras Laffan, which is the LNG. I think it's the biggest LNG production in the Middle East, in Qatar, and the Israelis attacked an Iranian gas field, the Pars gas fields, and about 2 hours later, the Iranians counterstruck and they hit the Exxon Mobil and Shell and Qatari LNG trains in Qatar. They did billions of dollars worth of damage in one hit, and they took out what the Qataris reckon was about $20 billion a year, and it'll probably take 5 years, so 20 billion times 5 years, to get back on track. An enormous hit. Now, that will be small compared to what the Iranians have promised to do yet. And one thing about the Iranians, they do seem to be fairly clear in their messaging. If they say they're going to do it, they do it. So if, as quite a few military analysts I've been following, if the Israelis and the Americans actually have another crack at Iran, do more damage, commit more war crimes, the Iranians have been perfectly clear that they will strike back hard. So that would mean, Abqaiq, oil fields in Saudi Arabia, the Yanbu east-west pipeline out to the Red Sea, all sorts of facilities, major facilities across the Gulf states, and whatever they can lay their missiles on in Israel will be hit really, really hard. And that will be terrible for the whole world. It will be shocking, and it should not be done. And the simple way to make sure it's not done is to keep those Americans and Israelis away from the sovereign state of Iran. And that's by the way, should I just chip in a comment about why hit the poor old Gulf states? Because I think in the Western media, the poor darlings, the innocents, the little sweetie pies. Why do those mean Iranians hit the Bahrain and UAE and all of this? And there's a simple reason for that. That they are under international law called co-belligerents. So in international law, if you house facilities that are used in military aggression, you are technically a co-belligerent, and the Iranians are very clear on that point. 14 US military bases in the Gulf, and also, dare I say it, Australian as well. There's Australian parts of some of these bases. You got these big bases like Saudi Arabia's King Fahd base, which took a good old slamming. And people like the Wall Street Journal, Middle East Eye, Washington Post have all documented the ways in which, major radar, billions of dollars of radar facilities, most of which have been now destroyed by the Iranians. Refueling planes that come and go from the airports, surveillance plane, drones, missiles, all of this have been used in the Gulf states. So they are most definitely co-belligerents. And when the Iranians put their letter through to the United Nations Secretary General claiming reparations off the Gulf state, they also supplied a very comprehensive dossier of satellite imagery showing the role of the Gulf states in the war of aggression on Iran. So I hope that answered the question.
I think what Eugene's doing here is really important. People need the receipts. And a lot of this information is publicly available in major mainstream outlets, but it is not platformed in the same way. So I think what is really important for people to know is when they're told that US is winning this war, is to go and look at these newspapers and these journals, these mainstream Western outlets who also do at the same time in small little pockets document the level of destruction that has happened and the financial loss. I think that is, important to consider when we, again, the lenses that we look at the world with. It shouldn't stop us from critically engaging with the facts.
think we're coming up to one final question, and I'm unfortunately going to have to quote from Christopher Luxon at length here for you, Mahdis. And we touched on this a little bit last fortnight as well in the other panel, because it's to do with the legitimacy of the government in Iran, and some of the coverage that we've seen of the protests and the riots there that were then used to create this narrative that led to the US war of aggression. So Luxon said, the legitimacy of a government rests on the support of its people. The Iranian regime has long since lost that support in the most brutal way possible. New Zealand stands with the brave people of Iran, and in recent weeks they have taken to the streets to demand regime change, only to be met by violence and murder. The Iranian people must be allowed to determine their own future and to live free from fear of their own government. That just felt horrible to say out loud.
Hey, Luck. I mean, I get all the Luxon questions. I don't think that Christopher Luxon has the support of the vast majority of the people in this country, first of all. Second of all, I think that assumes that the war started on Iran because Americans or Israelis give a damn about Iranian people, which is also false. That would also imply that after US military intervention, countries are more democratic than they were before. Again, if we look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, there is no evidence for that. In fact, in the history of US military aggression and invasion or coup in the globe, there is no evidence that a country was better off afterwards. So I think if I was to engage in good faith with Christopher Luxon, this is what I would say to him and say, well, you're kind of naively assuming something that there is no evidence to assume. The other one is to say that any form of dissent in Iran is immediately reframed as a desire to change the government. That is not to say that there aren't people in Iran who hate their government who would really love to see it changed. Just like there's lots of people here who hope that this is a one-term government. So I think for me, we have to unpack. We have to unpack the internal contradictions and the internal grievances populations might have with Iran, with the way it becomes mobilized to justify a stance that Western countries take. So I think we should be not naive to say that because there is this grievance and this internal contradiction, that the way they use it is true. So for me, I separate those, because what Luxon is doing, he's pretending that there is an interest for the Iranian people. There is not. The biggest evidence for that is that we bombed the country, well, not we, but they bombed the country for over a month and killed a bunch of civilian people. So I don't think they care as much about people as they say. The other one is that somehow in the international system, every time a population is unhappy, more powerful countries have the right to interfere in that other country's business. And that, unfortunately, is also not the case. And again, I think people get really caught up in their feelings, and it's really hard to sometimes reason with people who seem to perceive themselves to be on the other side than I am. Because I am not talking about my feelings about a country. I'm talking about, if this is the rights-based order, then these are the rules of the rights-based order that the West seems to want to uphold everywhere, to the point that it thinks we can bomb democracy into people, right? So I'm just trying to hold them to the account of the rules that they set. Okay, you don't want to play by those rules, then you have to give Iran the same rights to not play by those rules. So I think it's the question with what Luxon is trying to do is this manipulation of ideas to get people caught up, not to question the decisions that governments are making in support for this war. And when we push back against that, we get framed as being heartless people who don't believe that protesters have rights, etc., etc. And I always think, what's the purpose of that? The other layer that I think is important to mention is that when it comes to Iran, the idea of dissent is always already framed as being democratic in nature. So any form of dissent in Iran is a people's democratic right to express itself, I'm not saying it's not. There's definitely that as well. But there's also dissent that does not seek a more free Iran, a more sovereign Iran, a more independent Iran, right? So I think it would be saying that any form of dissent is always framed positively when it happens in Iran. But any form of dissent in Western countries is framed often as like people who are ludicrous. Like if by that logic, we should look at the parliament protest and say, hey, look, your population really hates you. It's time for regime change because people are camping outside the beehive. Right? So I think we need to be really carefully unpacking the layers because there's many. And that leads me to my last point, because I think the layers that are here is something to do with nuance and complexity. And every time people want to shut down and shun and silence the overtly anti-imperialist stance that is to stand with Iranian sovereignty and Iran's right to be sovereign, with not allowing nuance. And I say that we live in a media landscape and in a cultural landscape in which two main discourses circulate. One is Iran's the biggest threat to democracy. We need to bomb them because they're evil, barbaric people. And that's the main one. It's quite strong. I think a lot of, liberals might not love that discourse. And then there's this other discourse about human rights, women's rights. Iran is undemocratic and it crushes any form of dissent. That's the other dominant discourse. It might not be as dominant as this one, but it is still a dominant discourse that circulates. So then these people are telling anyone who says Iran's taking an anti-imperialist stance and and forcing the US kind of out of the region, they go, you're crushing nuance. You're not allowing nuance. And I say, well, actually, in a media landscape and a political landscape in which only these two positions are allowed, this conversation is more nuanced than we'll get, because it allows a layer of conversation to happen that is not openly circulating. It allows us to look at things that we're not currently looking at, right? So I think this nuance argument, which I don't think is nuance, I don't want more nuance, I want more complexity, has become a weapon to silence people and to create this false sense of there's only one way to talk about things, and that's the way we look at the world, not at the facts that are being created by this current situation, both globally, but also very, very locally. So that's kind of what I have to say about the way in which these words are used to manipulate. And I think they're being used to manipulate on multiple levels, and they manipulate with affect. This whole idea of Iran crushing its population and people in the diaspora saying that, anything is better than this, is to work with affect. And we're trying to counter that with facts, which is very hard, right? Like, we've got people filled with feelings and we're trying to reason with them with facts. And sometimes I think we need to do better storytelling to get across what we're trying to say. So I've tried to do that today by focusing on words. I'm not sure I achieved that fully, but yeah, so I think it's just a lot of feelings at the moment when it comes to knowing how to take a stance against the war.
Yeah, incredible.
Because it's 8:05.
Kia ora. Yeah, we are just coming up to time. Probably have just quickly time to ask what do we do about it here? I mentioned that polling right at the outset. Huge support against the war. We've also just had in the news over the last couple of days, it's been revealed that Prime Minister Christopher Luxon actually wanted stronger support for the US at the outset of the war. So this was when a bunch of the initial atrocities were being implemented by the US and Israel. What can we do here other than run an expert panel? Any final thoughts on that?
Go to organize peace marches, mobilize people, Don't alienate people. They come into this. I said that last time as well. I think people come out against war from very different angles and different moments in their lives, and we cannot afford to fragment an already very fragmented group of people who are mobilizing, because people are also very tired of after 2 years of mobilizing against genocide. So for me, we need to show up, and if we cannot engage with complexity with Iran, then it's all good. Then put that aside, and with whatever nuance or lack of nuance you have, just mobilize against war and sanctions, because sanctions are an extension of warfare. And let's just kind of come together on that ground and then build from there. Because I don't think we can afford not to do anything, and we also can't afford to not listen. I think this is where I'm at. This sounds very cliche and a little bit more lovey-dovey than I personally am. I'm also just really exhausted. I think this is, for me, as a person who doesn't really do a lot of work on Iran and doesn't talk a lot about Iran, I'm really exhausted about the conversations that I'm having. And I want to have them. I think it's important to have them. I'm doing them because I think it's important. But boy, I think it's time that people share the load.
Got it. Eugene, anything?
Yeah. Hey, awesome, Mahdis. I love what you said. And I think they're the two big points that we, everyone needs to mobilize, get off the bench. Or, I'm sure many of the people watching this are actually in the struggle. And I guess all of us just have to really intensify the struggle, make this turn this into a real anti-war, anti-imperialist, pro-peace movement. And I love what you said about, we've got to work together. We've just got to accept there's great diversity of people out there. So I love that. Hey, and I just say on a really positive note, just my last thought, the United Nations Charter is actually a really good document. I've read bits of it regularly over the last couple of years. And you think about Iran, and lots of people have got sort of all sorts of ideas, many of them negative about Iran. I've been to Iran a couple of times. I love the place. International law doesn't just apply to the countries you really like or the people like us and all that. International law applies to everyone. And there's a concept in the United Nations Charter called the sovereign equality of states. We're all equal. We're all equal. And the other concepts are things like non-interference in internal affairs. So it means even if you are a powerful white country, you do not have the right to go into other countries and tell them how to live their lives. Non-interference. And the prohibition on the use of force. Like we think in the West that powerful white countries have some God-given right to wander the planet attacking countries. They don't. We've got to get out of this really dreadful habit. And the very final thought I'll share from the UN Charter is the peaceful settlement of disputes. The peaceful settlement of disputes. So, kia tau te rangi Māori.
Kia ora, Eugene. Gabriella, any final things to add?
No, I just I thought that endpoint Mahdis about standing in complexity instead of nuance is such a powerful one, and I think back to October 2023 and how many people were having, or trying to have these nuanced conversations when it was so obvious that Israel was, setting the foundations for a full-blown genocide with the consent, effectively, of the Western liberal order. And I think that's the danger of nuance here. Nuance when annihilation is at stake. And I think our ability to stand in complexity is such a powerful, message for building true solidarity here. So I'll be digesting this kōrero. Thanks heaps to you both. I thought that was fantastic.
Kia ora, Gabriella. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and everyone who's been part of bringing this panel to the audience this evening. This is the second panel. There may be more coming in the future. We'll see what happens. But this will go up this has been live streamed on YouTube, and we'll put it up as a video recording as well. You'll also be able to hear it on the 1 of 200 podcast. We'll put it out as an audio podcast format too. So there'll be a variety of ways for you to share it with other people that you think would have something to gain from listening to this. I think, as everyone said, it's really important to organize, but it's really important to just let people come to this conversation in a variety of different ways, and to meet them where they're at. So hopefully you've also heard or been given a number of tools with which to approach some of the frames and the ways in which media and politicians are talking about this issue that we know are incorrect and often false, but people have been completely kind of dipped in. They've been soaking in it for decades now, and they may be at a different place in their journey learning about this stuff than you are. So I think be gentle with people as they come to the cause. We know that over 80% of people in New Zealand are against this war. They're not all going to be radical about it just yet, but we can have those conversations and we can bring them along with us and get them organized and get them mobilizing and hopefully getting some changes, maybe both in this government, but also in the policies that we are seeing New Zealand implement on the international stage. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you again to my wonderful panelists. Thank you to Gabriella for doing some hosting with me as well, with some fantastic questions. And we'll catch you on a future panel, or we'll catch you on 1 of 200 on the podcast or on some other live streams. We'll catch you next time.
Kia ora.
Ka kite, po Māori.